The sound seminar you're about to hear was recorded at the Poetry Center of the New York YMYWHA on November 20, 1967. This program presents John Barth reciting stories that he describes as two narratives for tape and live voice.
I guess I don't really believe that the printed word is kaput as a narrative medium. There's too much that you can do in it that you can't do any other way. On the other hand, in certain moods at least, it's enjoyable to frighten oneself by imagining that it might be. If you can't be in on the beginning of a genre, it's a rather nice idea to think that you might be in on the end of it. And it finally doesn't matter, historically or not. If enough people feel that they want to scare themselves this way, that feeling becomes a considerable fact, regardless of what turns out to be. In any case, it seems to me that the spoken word, and particularly the tape-recorded word, the voice-recorded word, has interesting possibilities of its own. It seems to me, for example, to say something obvious, that it combines some of the virtues of the oral narrative tradition, whence literature arises, the immediacy and the directness of a live voice, with some of the virtues of print, which the ordinary voice doesn't have, but the voice-recorded word has. It's interruptible. You can stop. Apparently you couldn't stop Homer unless you threw a bone at him or something. And it's referable. You can back it up, etc. But most important, it seems to me, is that like any medium of narrative, it has its own metaphorical potential. The medium bloody well isn't just the message, but it surely is or can be a metaphor for the message, and every medium has its own metaphorical possibilities. That's not a new idea. But to say something very obvious, for example, all people, certainly all writers, tend, for better or worse, to turn into the sound of their own voices as they go along, or to say it more kindly, all we have finally is a kind of way of talking. This is always the case, and with the voice-recorded word, where the voice is there but the author is not, that fact becomes, as it were, a literal metaphor. Well, it's some of these metaphorical possibilities of the voice-recorded word that I had a chance this summer to experiment with in several new short pieces, of which I'm going to do 2.5 tonight. The first one, which may be somewhat obscure on first hearing, is called Echo. I composed it originally for monophonic recording and disembodied author, and to make its point properly, you ought to hear it out of a loudspeaker at home in private circumstances. Now, you couldn't possibly do that in a hall. It would be as tedious as going to a concert and seeing someone put on a disc while you just sit and listen. So I'll do this first one live, though you'll have to, by an effort of the imagination, project yourself into a situation where you're hearing the voice but not seeing the speaker. In the myth, you'll remember, the nymph Echo is raped by Pan and subsequently becomes a master storyteller, as happened to Scheherazade and some other people. It may be an occupational requisite, who knows. Zeus engages her then to entertain his wife with fiction while he slips away and makes love to certain mountain nymphs. When Hera realizes that she's been gulled, she punishes Echo, who had in fact been innocent of Zeus's intentions in the first place, by depriving her of the ability to speak for herself. She can only repeat others' words, though the voice at this point remains her own. Later on in her career, she falls in love with beautiful Narcissus, the son of a blue nymph named Liriope. There you are. She was a nymph of a blue hue, and a minor river god. And when Narcissus rebuffs her, she grieves away until nothing's left of her but her voice, pure medium without substance or original content. Narcissus himself, it takes as long to explain this piece as it does to do it. Narcissus himself attempts to embrace his reflected image and then also pines away for frustration until he becomes a blooming narcotic. Somewhat later, the blind prophet Tiresias, who had foreseen all these events from the beginning and had in fact warned Narcissus's mother that her boy would lead a long and happy life if he never came to know himself, meets his own death beside the same wooded spring where Narcissus blossoms and Echo pines. That's the myth, and to it I've added only one detail, that in her final state, Echo loses her individual voice as well and repeats the words of others in their voices like a kind of proto-ampex. It follows that while the original narrator of this piece would seem to have been either Tiresias or Narcissus or myself, the voice you hear is just as possibly Echo's, and in fact, if you listen carefully, you may detect echoes in the narrative. What's more, since Tiresias can see backwards and forwards in time, and since all three of the principals in the narrative are more or less immortal, the events narrated may be already past, or foreseen for the future, or in process of occurring as narrated. Now I'm going to read this one live for the reasons I mentioned a while ago, and also because finally it's the voice, the sound, that matters. One does well to speak in the third person, the seer advises in the manner of Theban Tiresias. A cure for self-absorption is saturation, telling the story over as though it were another's until, like a much-repeated word, it loses sense. There's a cathartic Tiresias himself employs in the interest of objectivity and to rid himself of others' histories, Oedipus's, Echoes, which distract him fore and aft by reason of his entire knowledge. Narcissus replies that the prescription is unpalatable, but he's too weary of himself not to attempt it. Where to begin? The prophet's cave seems a likely place, which he stumbles into one forenoon in flight from his admirers. What started as a stag hunt has turned into yet another love chase, led this time by a persisting nymph, soon joined by her quarry's companions. It wants all the Narcissan craft, resentfully perfected, yet again to mislead the lot. An imperfectly dark passage. Outside his ardentest suitor calls, pederast Aminius, spurned. The nymph soft seconds his bugger woo. Chaste Narcissus shivers, draws farther in, loses bearings, daresn't call, weeps. The lifelong bother. Seized he gives shriek, is released. How come? What next? Hadn't he as well have his blossom plucked? Who says so? Tiresias the prophet. What's he doing here? Conversing with Narcissus. How does he know? Because he knows everything. Why isn't he in Thebes? For the reason that, as during a prior and a posterior extravagance of his, Thebes is enjoying an interregnum hard on prophets. First there was the Sphinx, whose elementary riddle was none of his affair. He withdrew to the Thespian cave, there acted as advisor to the blue nymph Lyrope, Narcissus's mother. The current pass is sorer, Oedipus's tragedy, too awful to rehearse. The third and last, couple hundred months hence, darker yet from Tiresias's point of view. Narcissus reflects that after years of illusion, he's at the seer's mercy, rape-wise. He wonders which is more ironic, seeking refuge for innocence where it mightn't be preserved, or falling into the first hands he's ever seemed to leave cold. Thus rare Tiresias's apostrophe. Some are comelier than most, a few handsome. It's Narcissus's fate, through fault nor merit of his own, to be beautiful beyond enduring. The first catch eye, the second turn head. Narcissus, like a fleshed theophany, smites the whole sense. A philosopher argues that perceptible beauty is ipso facto less desirable than At glimpse of Narcissus, he interrupts, forswears himself. A man, doubtless of his virility, admits what he'd sooner not. In one extraordinary case, at least, he's felt the catamitic itch. A woman, indifferent thitherto to the world's including handsomer men than hers, finds Narcissus so, she's cross with her lover. Thus the mature, who see to it that sight of the wonder doesn't linger or recur, and so in most cases come to terms with memory. The philosophers resume their positions, men manliness, women men, all chastened, one supposes, by an exception so exceptional it ruins their rules. Among the less disciplined and wise, astonishment yields to simple lust. Cynical, powerful, wanton, uncommitted, passionate, impulsive, set out to have their will. Hosts of ordinary too, strangers to emotion of extraordinary kind or force, are seized as by conversion. Snares are laid, gifts tendered, pitfalls dug. His very wet nurse, Liriope says, took liberties with her suckling, tutor, tutti. Liriope herself, how was it? Undone by a meandering river god, she seeks the caved seer first. What counsel does he offer? Tiresias won't repeat it. Enough to say it's of a kind with what he wishes he'd given Oedipus. The varieties of general good advice are few. Liriope suggests herself to Narcissus when he reaches young manhood and begs him to ignore her advice. Take to the woods. Into the bimboed and bebuggered bush he flies, where ladies beckon every way and gentlemen crouch in ambuscado. All this considered, one may wonder at Tiresias's immunity, unless indeed he's cat and mousing. Is he too ravished by his victim to recollect himself for rape, floored for defloration? No. Clairvoyance is anti-aphrodisiac. One recalls, too, Tiresias has been without sex for a long time. What's more, he's blind as a bat. Otherwise, he couldn't see so in the cave. Is Narcissus piqued or relieved? Both know. He presently inquires how one in his position might best fend the world's importune. Why fend? Tiresias's story is to the point, and echoes. A nymph possessed so early and entirely by Pan that her subsequent affairs seem redundant. Afflicted with immortality, she turns from life and learns to tell stories with such art that the Olympians implore her to repeat them. Others live for the lie of love. Echo lives for her lovely lies, loves for their livening. With her tongue-tried tales she amuses others and preserves her reason. But Zeus employs her, unawares, to beguile his wife while he makes free with the mountain nymphs. Again, begs the queen of heaven. Another mount's climbed with each retelling. At fiction's end, the facts are clear. Zeus unpunishable, Echo pays. Though her voice remains her own, she can't speak for herself thenceforth, only give back others' delight, regardless of hers. Has this to do with fair Narcissus, wise Tiresias? Whose story is it? It's a tale of shortcomings, lengthened to advantage. Echo, never as popularly held, repeats all like gossip or mirror. She edits, heightens, mutes, turns others' words to her end. One recalls her encounter with Narcissus. No other has nymphed him caveward, a coincidence of opposites. One should, if it's worthwhile, repeat the tale. I'll repeat the tale. Though in fact many are bewildered, Narcissus conceives himself alone and becomes the first person to speak. I can't go on. Go on. Is there anyone to hear? Here. Who are you? You. I. Then let me see me. See. Alas. Alas. Etc., etc. Overmuch presence appears to be the storyteller's problem. Tiresias's advice in cases of excessive identity and coitus irrequitus is to make of withdrawal a second nature. He sees the nymph efface herself until she becomes no more than her voice, still transfiguring senseless sound into plaints of love. Perhaps that's the end of her story. Perhaps the narrative proper may resume. Not quite. Not quite. Though even sharp-sight Tiresias can't espy the unseeable, one may yet distinguish narrator from narrative, medium from message. One lesson remains to be learned. When Echo learns it, none will be the wiser. But Narcissus, what's become of contemptible, untemptable Narcissus, the drug so many have turned on, and sung themselves on pretext of hymning him? Was Tiresias about to counsel him in obscurity? No, except to declare that his true love awaits him in the spring at Donacone. Discovering who he is will prove as fatal to Narcissus as it's proving for Oedipus. Queer advice. To see the truth is one thing, to speak it another. Now where are we? That is to say, where are Tiresias and Narcissus? Somewhere near the Donaconan spring. Who's telling the story and to whom? The teller's immaterial, Tiresias declares. The tale's the same, and for all one knows, the speaker may be the only auditor. Considerable time has elapsed, it seems, since seer and seeker, prophet and lost, first met in the cave. But what's time when past and future are equally clear and dark? The gift of swiscience is a painful present. Narcissus thirsts for love. Tiresias sees the end of his second sight. Both speak to themselves. Thebes is falling. Unknown to the northbound refugees, en route to found a new city, their seer will perish on the instant the Argives take the old. He it is now, thrashing through the woods near Thespii, who calls to his lost companions and follows to exhaustion a mock response. Halloo, halloo! Falling at length beside a chuckling spring, he dreams or dies. The voice presently in his ears is that hallooer's. Now it rehearses Narcissus's end, seen from the outset. Why did Tiresias not tell Narcissus what he once told Liriope, that her son would lead a long and happy life if he never came to know himself? Because the message then had become its own medium. Needless to say, he sees and saw Narcissus beat about the bush for love, oblivious to pursuers in the joy of his own pursuit. As for that nymph whose honey voice still recalls his calls, he scorns her and hears his maledictions balmed to music. Like the masturbatory adolescent, sooner or later he finds himself. He beholds and salutes his pretty alter ego in the spring. In the spring, his ego, altered, prettily salutes. Behold, in vain he reaches to embrace his contrary image. He recognizes what Tiresias couldn't warn him of. Has knowing himself turned him into a pansy? Not quite, not quite. He's resolved to do away with himself, his beloved likewise. Together now, adored in vain, farewell. Well, one supposes that's the end of the story. How is it this voice persists, whosever it is? Needless to say, Tiresias knows. It doesn't sound nymphish. She must have lost hers. Echo says Tiresias is not to be trusted in this matter, a prophet blind or dead, a blossom eyeless, a disengendered tale. None can tell teller from told. Narcissus would appear to be opposite from Echo. He perishes by denying all except himself. She persists by effacing herself absolutely, yet they come to the same. It was never himself Narcissus craved, but his reflection, the echo of his fancy. His death must be partial as his self-knowledge. The voice persists, persists. Can it be believed? Tiresias has gone astray. A voice not impossibly his own has bewildered him. The story of Narcissus, Tiresias, Echo is being repeated. It's alleged that Narcissus has wearied of himself and yearns to love another. On Tiresias' advice, he employs the third person to repeat his tale as the seer does until it loses meaning. No use. His self objectified's the more enthralling, like his blooming image in the spring. In vain Tiresias cautions that the nymph may be nothing altruistic, but the soul of guile and sleight of tongue. Who knows but what her love has changed to mock? What she gives back as another's speech may be entire misrepresentation. Especially ought one to beware what she chooses to repeat concerning herself. No use, no use. Narcissus grows fond. She speaks his language. Tiresias reflects that after all, if one aspires to concern one's fatal self with another, one had as well commence with the nearest and readiest. Perhaps he'll do the same, be beguiled with Narcissus out of knowledge of himself. Listen silent as his voice goes on. Thus we linger forever on the autognostic verge. Not you and I, but Narcissus, Tiresias, Echo. Are they still in the Thespian cave? Have they come together in the spring? Is Narcissus addressing Tiresias, Tiresias, Narcissus? Have both expired? There's no future for prophets. Blind Oedipus will never see the place where three roads meet. Narcissus desired himself dead before his panic conception. He's been rooted forever by the beloved he'll never know. Dead Tiresias still stares wide-eyed at wisdom's nude entire. Our story's finished before it starts.